True Murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with Sam.
The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. The western suburbs of Chicago were being terrorized by a serial rapist and murderer in the 1970s and 1980s. Bruce Lindahl was a psychotic rapist and killer who preyed on girls and young women for almost a decade. He managed to escape detection because he did not leave his rape victims alive. But in 1980, he kidnapped and raped Deborah Colliander in Aurora, Illinois. She escaped before he could murder her, and Lindahl finally was arrested. 2 months later, just before he was to go on trial on charges of kidnapping, rape, and deviant sexual assault, Lindahl kidnapped and murdered Miss Colliander. Lindahl disposed of her body and no one could find her. The following year, because the victim did not show up in court, the kidnapping and rape charges had to be dropped, and he could not be charged with murder without a body. Reporter Jim Ridings wrote a number of stories for the Beacon News over several months, determined to shine a light to try to stop Lindahl from getting away with another murder. Suddenly, the public knew the truth about this monster, who had been able to evade justice and public attention. Aurora police said Lindahl planned to kill Ridings once the judge finally dismissed the case. But fortunately, a few days after the charges were dropped, Lindahl accidentally killed himself while murdering another person. The story took another turn nearly 40 years after Lindahl's death, when DNA tests linked Lindahl to an unsolved cold case murder from 1976. Murder in the Fox Valley tells the story of Bruce Lindahl's terrible crime spree and how he finally was stopped. The book we're featuring this evening is Murder in the Fox Valley, the true story of serial killer Bruce Lindahl, with my special guest, journalist and author, Jim Ridings. Welcome to the program, and thank you for this interview, Jim Ridings.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on this extraordinary book. You write that the western suburbs of Chicago were terrorized by a serial rapist and murderer in the 1970s and early 80s. And you were a reporter and wrote dozens of stories for the Beacon News over several months. Let's talk about and take us back to June 23rd, 1980, Deborah Colliander, 25-year-old, and the Northgate Shopping Center. This is in Aurora, Illinois, around 11 in the morning. Tell us who Deborah Colliander is and tell us what happens that day.
Deborah was a dietitian at the local hospital. She was on her way to a gym to work out in the morning, as she always did. A man came up to her as she was locking up her bicycle. He came up and said, "Could you help me start my car?" No, she was kind of hesitant about that, but he said, "Just all you have to do is put your foot on the gas pedal while I work the engine." So she said, okay. So she got in the car, and then he put a sharp object to her neck, told her to move over. He drove to his house. He took off his belt and looped it around her neck and then led her into the house. Then he attacked and raped her in a most violent manner, which I later found out was his style. Afterwards, he fell asleep. She managed to get out and go to a neighbor's house. The cops were called, and they came to the house, and they arrested him. The first cop on the scene was David Torres, who just happened to be Lindahl's best friend, and he owned the house.
Now, because he knew Bruce Lindahl, he told his partner, Officer Sam, that he would deal with him. And so they knocked on the door. What was the state of Bruce Lindahl at that time? And what happens as a result? What did they find in their search during his arrest?
Well, they found the gun that he was holding to Deborah. They found a bunch of Polaroid pictures that he had taken of her and some other incriminating evidence. He didn't seem too, from what I could tell, he didn't seem too upset of, like, what's this all about, especially when he saw his best friend. They took him in and booked him, and he was held in the county jail.
Now, tell us about his efforts to get bail and be bonded out. And what about Deborah? What does she say to police concerning her ordeal and also to her sister, especially about the behavior of this person during the assault.
Deborah gave a full report to the police, and she told her sister Sue all about it, and that she was basically traumatized by it. But she was determined to go to court, even though it was very upsetting. She was going to go to court just to see that he was put away and didn't do this to any other women.
So at the same time, she tells her sister, and she believes that she is safe because he's behind bars. She even moves after this rape to another location. And you write that she moves closer to the hospital. She has a security guard walk her to her car. So she's recovering from this ordeal, but believes that he's in jail. Meanwhile, what happens?
Well, she didn't know this, but she bailed out a month after the attack in July 1980. So on October 7th, 1980, she was getting off work at the hospital about 9 p.m. and she walked to her car and was headed home. She only lived about 7 blocks away. And that's when she got in her car, that's the last anybody saw her.
Now, you write that there was the location where her home was, and the idea that maybe she was abducted was considered. What about the location was ideal, we'll say, for some sort of an abduction at that location?
Well, it was an old house divided up into a number of apartments, and she parked in the back. There's an area in the back. It was not well lit. There were some bushes. Lindahl was hiding in the bushes, and when she got out of the car, headed to the apartment house, he grabbed her, and the details we don't know, but he killed her, and he took her out to a farm field, and he buried the body.
Now, tell us, as you write about this Bruce Lindahl, he was working as a small engines repair instructor in Caneland. Tell us a little bit more about this Bruce Lindahl and what happens with police in pursuit of the missing Deborah Colliander.
Well, initially, the police were told to treat this as just another missing person case, which is ridiculous because she was a couple of weeks away from going to court to testify against this guy. And all of a sudden she vanishes. You've got to be suspicious about that. The officers were told this is just another missing person case. She could be any place. She might have taken off.
The parents, Viking and artist Colliander, are not reassured by the police whatsoever and immediately travel to Aurora in November looking for their daughter. And they say they had little help from police. So they hire a private investigator. They do as much as they can, or they believe they can. And then tell us about the response, what happens as a result of this missing persons case in their regard.
Police weren't telling them anything, and they weren't helping them at all. And they felt police weren't even doing anything. That's what they felt. They came to the Beacon News to talk to me because I had done a few articles about this. And I had known Deborah just very casually because the year before, we both worked at local mental health hospital. I was working there undercover to find out all the details of all the abuses and so on and so forth that went on. So she was a dietitian at that mental health center. And then she went to work at the hospital. So they asked me if I would help, and I said yes. So I kept doing more articles. And these articles, for the first time, Lindahl's name was used. He was anonymous. That's how he got away with all of attacking all these women, is because he was not charged. Like I said, most of the time, and nobody knew this at the time, these women just went missing. Most of the time, there was no body to be found. He was not charged. So he was getting away with it. And my articles were the first ones that actually named him as the obvious suspect in Deborah Colliander's disappearance. And I mentioned other cases of women who were missing. And I think people could add 2 and 2, and suddenly he was well known. He got fired from his job when he was arrested and spent a month in jail. So at the last minute, Caneland High School needed a small engine teacher, and he applied for it. And of course, he lied about his background. So they hired him. So he was teaching high school kids small engines.
You write about also that this Karen Weeks, you had spoken to her as well as a result of Deborah's disappearance. What did she have to say? And you write that these articles started heating up with the newspaper coverage. The case began heating up. Were you pushing? Was there some pressure on police as a result of the articles that you were writing?
I think so, but I don't know what that amounted to. I know that eventually they put him under surveillance. which I didn't know at the time. In fact, I didn't know until this year when I did the book.
This hearing that was supposed to happen, so the articles that you are writing in the Beacon News are being published. What kind of pressure is the media effect on Bruce Lindahl, and what does he do as a result?
Well, I think it mostly had an impact on the court, because when he came up for a preliminary hearing, his lawyer said, well, Judge, this woman didn't even care enough to show up in court to press charges. So we asked that the charges be dismissed. By that time, the judge and everyone else had seen all my articles. She was missing. So I think the newspaper coverage put pressure on the judge and the courts. No, we're not going to dismiss the charges now. His lawyer filed a motion for a speedy trial, which means it has to come to court within 160 days or be dismissed. So it kept coming up, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 times for a preliminary hearing. And the judge kept continuing it until he had to drop it. And I think the newspaper story had a lot to do with that, because in any other case, I think the judge would have dismissed the case. You know, we don't have a witness to testify against this guy, so we have to dismiss it.
You talk about her car being finally found February 16th, when a person came into the newsroom that had been following the stories and had recognized the vehicle.
Yeah, a man came up to my office and said, I think we found Debbie's car. You know, I walked by, it looked like it. I got the article, and it's the same make and model and license. And I said, okay, well, let's go down and look at it. So I went down to the train station parking lot with him, and it was her car. And then I called the police and so told them to come and get it.
As I mentioned, this Viking Colliander, Deborah's father, hires a private investigator. And then that private investigator contacts you in January of 1981. What does he tell you? And then tell us about this anonymous informant and Byron Marshall.
Well, the private detective that he hired talked to me on a number of occasions. I think he wanted to know what I knew, and I wanted to know what he knew. And he had told me some things that I didn't publish at the time. I put it in the book in 2022, but not in 1980. He knew a couple of Chicago cops that would arrest Lindahl on a false charge and take him somewhere and beat the information out of him to where Debbie is. And then they would dispose of Lindahl. He would never be found. But it didn't happen. Debbie's father didn't go through with that.
You write about the state's attorney, Robert Morrow, reviewing the 75 pages of police files and met with Aurora Police Chief Robert Brent and the chief of detectives, Don McDonald, and all efforts to locate Deborah were conducted. There was no witness against Lindahl at this case. So as you write, the charges were dropped. And it's interesting that you wrote that you tried to chase him down, you and a partner, to try to get an interview or a photo, I guess. And you have a chapter called Poetic Justice, April 4th, 1981. Less than a week later, what happened?
Well, as far as the chasing down, he was at one of the preliminary hearings, and I knew they always snuck him in and out the back way. He didn't come in the normal way. So me and our staff photographer, we wanted to catch up to him. I wanted to talk to him. We ran down this courthouse steps. We were coming out the other way. We chased him for about a block or so. And he went into a flower shop. By the time we caught up with the shop, he was out the back door and we'd lost him. And I thought, well, why is this? This is a homicidal maniac. And he ran away from me. Now, on April 4th, Lindahl went to a bowling alley in Naperville looking for potential victims. He met this 18-year-old boy, and somehow he convinced the boy to come to his apartment and his girlfriend's apartment, which was a short distance away. Exactly how he did that, exactly what happened, we don't know. What we know is inside that apartment, he stabbed the boy to death. He stabbed him 28 times. And in the frenzy of wildly stabbing the boy, one of the swings went wild and he hit himself in the thigh. It cut a major artery and he bled to death on the scene.
You write that it was poetic justice that this serial rapist would die from stabbed by his own hand to his groin.
Yes, that was poetic justice.
It's interesting, too. We didn't mention that he had this girlfriend that finally realized that the kind of abusive person he really was and was trying to leave, but she was at the home. She was asleep when apparently this attack happened and awoke to this nightmare from some sort of sleep or some kind of drug-hazed unconsciousness that she was experiencing in the room and didn't witness any of the carnage. But police had some questions for her.
Yeah, she was finally getting wise to who he was and what he was because of the newspaper coverage. So she moved out of the house they had and into an apartment in Naperville. He was with her that night. He wasn't going to let her go. So she was in her bedroom with the door locked. She had been intoxicated that night. So she didn't hear what was going on. She got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. When she came out of the bathroom, she saw these two dead bodies on the floor, just soaked in blood. And then she called the police. The police did have a lot of questions for her, but her story held up. What she wasn't lying or covering up anything. What she told them turned out to be so.
Tell us who Byron Marshall is, and he called you at home to tell you that Lindahl was dead. So tell us who he is and what else he had to say. And you talked to your editor, Mary Lou Bissett. So what happens with that conversation?
Well, Byron Marshall was a stockbroker in Chicago, and he also was a skydiver, and so was Lindahl. So he knew Lindahl from the airport, and he didn't like him. So once Deborah disappeared, he started calling me with information about Lindahl and things like that. And I don't know how he knew, but he knew before I did that Lindahl was dead. He called me in the morning and said that Lindahl was dead in this apartment and so on and so forth. So I called my editor and told her, and I said, I'm going over there right now. And I did. And there were cops all over the apartment building. And then I went down to the police station and talked to them and got all the details.
You found out that you had a direct effect on Bruce Lindahl. What did you find out in terms of that effect on him?
My articles exposed him to the public. He was unknown. His name was not known. This was causing him a lot of trouble. He lost his job. Friends turned against him. He had told the police that he felt personally threatened by me because of my newspaper. By that, he thought that I might try to kill him. He got some anonymous threatening letters and took those to the police and said he thought I sent them. So, I mean, he was kind of losing his mind on this. When he was at the high school teaching, he was trying to seduce some young boy, and he had a phone call with a boy that he taped, and that was illegal eavesdropping. So the police came to his house to serve a warrant for that. He saw them coming. He closed the door. He went in the kitchen and pulled a shotgun. And as the police came in, well, the cops, I guess, talked him into putting the shotgun down. But he panicked because he thought the Deborah's body had been found and they were coming to get him when it was just a warrant for eavesdropping.
So how do police proceed with this investigation?
I don't know that they did much because, in a way, they couldn't do much. They didn't have a body. They didn't have a witness. They didn't have evidence. They could have searched his house. They could have searched his car, which they did after he died, and found evidence, hair and newspaper with Deborah's name on it in the trunk of his car. They could have done that, but they didn't. They didn't do a whole lot. Once Deborah disappeared, now they had him under surveillance, but they had him under surveillance until she disappeared.
Now let's find out what you find out with your investigation. And so many people spoke to you, and you talk about that in 2019, Detective Loudon speaks to you about Pamela Maurer. Let's talk about the idea that there was other victims and your research into that idea.
Well, once Lindahl died, I had already done some articles about women and young teenage girls who had gone missing. And it kind of dawned on me, I wonder if he had anything to do with this. So I did a couple more articles on that. And I talked to police chiefs in other towns. And it kind of, all of these disappearances kind of fit the same pattern, and they kind of fit his pattern. So I asked the question back in 1981, after he died, did he do these? Nothing came of that until 2019. Detective Chris Loudon of the Lisle Police Department was looking into a cold case. He had seen that there had been advances in DNA technology, and he wondered if DNA could help him in this 1976 case. So he did a lot of investigating on his own. He said when he was in the Kendall County Coroner's office, he saw a file with a whole bunch of articles of mine about Lindahl. So he kind of focused on Lindahl. He interviewed Lindahl's brother, who was not that cooperative, but the more he got into it, he thought Lindahl might be the man. So he wanted some DNA from Lindahl. He asked the brother for DNA. He said no. He said, okay, can I have permission to exhume the body and get DNA? He said no. So he went to court, got a court order to exhume Lindahl's body. And he did. And he got DNA, and it was a match.
You talk about the role of genetic genealogy in this as well. Further advances in DNA that help solve the Golden State Killer case. Tell us about those advances and its relation to this.
Well, that's kind of technical. Come up with all kinds of new technology, pinpointing people and ancestry and native origin and even specific genes and specific families. And when they compared the DNA of the killer from 1976 to Lindahl's DNA, that came up as a match. And they found out, okay, he's the one who killed this 16-year-old girl in 1976.
Tell us about the investigation into the death of Pamela Maurer and tell us about her death.
She was 16, and it was 1976. She was at some friend's house, and she was going to leave and walk to McDonald's and get a Coke, like that. So she left the house, and she wasn't seen again until someone found her body along the side of the road the next morning. She had been raped and strangled. The thing about that is the detective at the time was named Ken Wilbur. He went to a bunch of apartment houses in Woodridge to ask questions about people, if they saw anything, if they heard anything. He knocked on one woman's door and she said, yeah, I heard screams coming from the apartment, Lindahl's apartment last night. Okay, so he went to Lindahl's apartment, and Lindahl said, yeah, we were having a party, and that's that. That's all the investigating he did. If he had looked into a little bit more, he might have found out that Lindahl not only killed this young woman, but killed a whole bunch of other young women, because he had been caught a few times with women who were bleeding or women who had made accusations against him, but nothing ever came to that. So this detective just sort of fell down on the job. All the women who killed after 1976 could have been alive if he had done his job.
So when did they finally get the confirmation of Pamela Maurer and Bruce Lindahl's involvement?
That wasn't until Chris Loudon in the Lisle Police Department sent the DNA off to a lab, and that was in late 2019.
Now, with that confirmation, you write that there was other jurisdictions obviously interested in Bruce Lindahl potentially. What kinds of numbers are we looking at realistically that he is suspected in being involved with murders and rapes?
It's kind of hard to tell, because at least a dozen, I'm certain more, but it's hard to tell because the women went missing, and in many cases, their bodies have not been found. So how are you going to link that? And if they did find a body today, Lindahl's DNA would not be on it anymore. So, I mean, some people have said, up to 30. Well, I don't know about that, but we just don't know.
Let's stop for a second to hear from our sponsor, which is Talkspace. Putting yourself first in the new year doesn't have to be a challenge, thanks to Talkspace. Using Talkspace feels a little like having a mental health professional in your pocket. Talkspace offers therapy and psychiatry, and being able to reach out to my provider anytime, anywhere, makes taking care of my mental health super easy. Whether I'm working or managing everyday tasks, taking care of my own mental health has never been easier. Working through things in therapy can be tough, but connecting with my therapist isn't. Plus, you can get help with or without insurance. Most insured members only pay a $25 copay or less. I wholeheartedly recommend Talkspace for therapy. You can sign up online and get a personalized match with a provider that's right for you, typically within 48 hours. You can text, video, or send voice messages to your licensed therapist, so it's incredibly convenient to have virtual sessions from the comfort of your home. Talkspace has thousands of licensed therapists with years of experience in over 40 specialties, including depression, anxiety, substance abuse, trauma, anger management, relationship issues, food and eating, and so much more. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com and use code TrueMurder. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com and use the code TrueMurder to get $100 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's TrueMurder and Talkspace.com. Now, when we last spoke, we were talking about the DNA had solved the Pamela Maurer case. Other jurisdictions were inquiring about Bruce Lindahl. He's suspected in other murders and other rapes. You chronicle in this book so many other similar MOs and even signatures of Bruce Lindahl that seem to be correspond with some of the crimes that you chronicle in this book, rapes, and again, some people got away, fortunately. The idea that this could happen, you outline how this could possibly happen, and the cooperation that you received from many police departments, however, not in Aurora so much. Tell us about your investigation or your at least look into David Torres and the what we can only call as the Aurora Police Department not doing their job.
The police in other jurisdictions cooperated with me when I asked questions, but they didn't coordinate among themselves. If they had, they might have seen some of the similarities in the cases they had. As far as David Torres goes, he's kind of a question mark. He was Lindahl's best friend. They went out together all the time. They went skydiving. Now, today he says he didn't know anything about it, but I don't know how he could not have known something was up with Lindahl.
In terms of his role in the investigation, you write that the reports about the crimes itself were kept from a certain detective or a certain officer. And you speculate that that certainly must have been David Torres. And for the police to not trust him with those police files sort of seems to indicate that he might have been prone to interfere on behalf of his friend.
Well, that's what Byron Marshall told me. But David Torres told me that he didn't. Yeah, the police kept the files away from him, but they were still friends.
What about Annette Lazar? Tell us about her and the crime perpetrated against her and that investigation into the likelihood that Bruce Lindahl was involved.
Well, I was just going to get into that. More than a year before Deborah Colliander was attacked, Annette Lazar was walking to a friend's house, and Lindahl said, "Hey, come on over," And so she went over to his house. He got her to come in. He pulled a gun on her, and he took her to the bedroom and attacked her in just the same way he did with Debbie. She might have been killed too, except she was smart. She started to flatter him and say he was handsome, and here's my number, you can call me again. Well, his whole personality changed then from a vicious, mean person to all of a sudden became nice. Oh, okay. Well, she was just saying that so she could get out, and she did. She went to the police, and who was the investigating officer? David Torres. Who owned the house? David Torres. Who is Lindahl's best friend? David Torres. David Torres questioned her as if she was the guilty party. He said, "Look at this. Your name and number is on this piece of paper. You gave this to him. Why did you do that?" She said, "To save my life. That's why I did it." The police would not, I guess they didn't believe her, or they didn't pursue it. If they had, he might have been put in jail, and Debbie Colliander would be alive, and a whole bunch of other women would be alive. But the police wouldn't pursue it.
You write about her undergarments not being tested versus Pamela Maurer's underpants being tested 43 years later. Tell us what you write about that.
Yeah, that's another insane thing. They said, "Well, this happened like 8 hours ago. The evidence on your panties would not be any good anymore. Too old." And I thought, well, wait a minute. Pamela Maurer's panties were still good after 43 years. Why would DNA on Annette not be any good the same day? It just shows they didn't want to pursue this. And I don't know how much influence Torres had, but maybe he had influence. Maybe the police just didn't want one of their own to look bad. I don't know.
We didn't write about Deborah Colliander's remains being finally found in April 27th of 1982. And they brought in a prestigious and prominent forensic scientist who had worked on the John Wayne Gacy case, among others. What did they find? What did he find in terms of the determination of the cause of death and any other thing that might be evidentiary for police?
Well, they did not find a cause of death. There were no bullet holes. There were no stab wounds. There was no broken bones or skull or anything. So he probably just strangled her to death. That would be the quietest and least messy way of killing her behind her apartment building that night. So there was no cause of death. But the police did look in the trunk of his car. Finally, they found hairs belonging to Debbie. So they obviously transported her in the trunk. They found some newspapers and mail with Debbie's name on it, which means that Lindahl was in her apartment building waiting for her, finding out which apartment she was in. And they pretty much, it's obvious he did it. Nobody else could have done it.
You write of all kinds of similar occurrences that seem to be related to Bruce Lindahl, and also that a couple characters named Charles Nichols and Jerry Lindahl, his brother. What information did they give you? Were they cooperative at all?
Charles Nichols was cooperative. He was also one of Lindahl's best friends, but he eventually woke up and kind of turned against them. And he talked to me a bit. Lindahl's brother, of course, would not talk to me.
What about Patricia Perkins? You had asked to speak to her. What do you think of her role in this and the idea that she was oblivious to the things that he was up to?
I think she met him and fell in love with him, and they moved in. And when she went to work every day, which Lindahl free to seek out women and attack them, I think she was just blind to what was going on. But once the newspaper articles started about him, she was kind of waking up herself. And that's when she moved to Naperville, to her own apartment.
You say that Nichols always suspected Bruce of the murders?
I think he had an idea. That he was guilty of these. Eventually, it kind of dawned on him.
You write in this book, too, you title it The Making of a Monster. Bruce was born in 1953 in St. Charles, Illinois. His father was Jerome and his mother was Arlene, and he had 3 other siblings, and his parents soon divorced, and he lived with his father, with his brother Jerry. Tell us what you found in terms of his behavior and some events in his early life.
Well, he and his father did not get along. They hated one another. He moved out when he was a senior in high school and lived with a family of a friend. Some people might say, his traumatic upbringing, the divorce and all this might have caused this. I don't buy that for a minute. A lot of people get divorced and their kids don't turn into psychotic killers, This was all on him.
You did write more about David Torres and the idea that he was more involved than anyone could ever imagine. Tell us what you rewrote about the potential of his involvement.
The potential, who knows what the potential could have been. It could have been a lot. It could have been what he says. He's still alive and he's denying that he had anything to do with anything, and he didn't know that he was doing this. But once Lindahl was dead, he was asked, do you think he could have been a serial killer? And he said, yeah, I do. Well, how come you didn't think that when he was alive?
But you write about this airport and the idea that his car was seen at the airport, that he couldn't have another vehicle. What of this idea of yours?
Well, this is something I didn't know until a few months ago, before I finished the book. I had found out that the police had Lindahl under surveillance. They were following him. And I didn't know that. And I also didn't know until I talked to Torres this summer. And he told me that this one time when they were skydiving, and when they finished skydiving, Lindahl said, could you give me a ride home? I said, oh, okay, I will. And you know what? I'm not feeling too good. I'm just going to lay down in the back seat. Oh, okay, go ahead. And then according to Torres, he said once they left the airport, it sort of dawned on him that Lindahl was hiding in the back seat to evade somebody. I didn't know who he was evading. He could have figured it out. He was a cop. Lindahl was a suspect. But then it sort of dawned on me, okay, that would have been the night he killed Debbie Colliander. Because if he was being watched the whole time and the cops were sitting watching his car at the airport and he gets away, they're still sitting there watching his car. And he gets away. That was the one night he had when he wasn't being watched. And that would be the night that he killed Debbie. I didn't know that until now. And I sort of figured that out after Torres told me that he helped him get away.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second for these messages. Now, with that idea in mind, and you write that he is suspected in so many rapes and murders that seem to have his signature and MO written all over them. What of police linking him to other murders and other rapes using, as you write about, the Parabon nanolabs and their breakthroughs in genetic genealogy?
Well, I know some police departments are looking into old cases, and of course they won't talk about that until they have something. But the problem with that is you have to have the DNA of the victim and the DNA of the suspect. A lot of these victims don't exist. Their bodies were not found. With the other victims, they don't have the DNA of the suspect. So I don't know what the likelihood is of solving any more cold cases. I think this was solved in late 2019. They announced it in early 2020. That's been quite a while. They've got Lindahl's DNA because they dug up his body. I think if they could have solved any of these cases they would have done it by now.
You write that you obtained the Bruce Lindell file from Aurora Police Department in 2022 through the Freedom of Information Act. You wrote that it is surprisingly slim, unlike hundreds of pages from police departments in Naperville, Lislow, Woodridge, and Downers Grove. Tell us what your deduction is, your conclusion is in terms of this investigation by Aurora Police Department.
Well, there's a lot that I know that they didn't give me. One example is when they came to his house to serve the warrant for illegal eavesdropping, and he pulled a shotgun out. That report was not given to me. And I know it exists because I had it at the time, 1981, and I did a story about it in 1981. So I know it exists, but
Wow.
They didn't give it to me. And there has to be a file on surveillance. They didn't give that to me. Somebody else, a couple of other people told me about it, but that was not in the file. It was very slim, hardly any information at all. And when you think of the other police departments, Downers Grove, for example, hundreds of pages, Naperville, hundreds of pages. They had everything they had on them because they're supposed to. When you file a Freedom of Information Act request, they're supposed to give it to you.
Chris Loudon was very vocal about his opinion about this, and he used the word cover-up. Tell us what he had to say regarding that. And you also talk about police reports for Annette Lazar in 79 and Deborah Colliander in 1980. Just some discrepancies that you noticed, and what did you make of that?
Well, actually, both attacks were quite similar. With Annette, they just totally discounted it. They didn't believe her at all. With Deborah, they did believe her. They came, they arrested him. Obviously, they had him with the goods, all the gun and the photographs and all that. But, if they had surveillance on Lindahl, they should have had it. They should have especially had it on Debbie because she was the one who would have been attacked. He could always get away, which he did, but they should have been watching her too.
You have a chapter called Questions Remain. What do you talk about? Accomplices, potentially? What do you discuss?
Oh, he was involved in a whole lot of things. He had hundreds of photographs of naked women. Some looked willing. Most looked either intoxicated or terrified. Now, there's too many for all of them to be his victim. But the police said that, a lot of these types of people, they will swap photos. And he may have even been involved in child pornography too, which, we don't know for certain because, by the time that came out, he was dead. I don't know I don't think he had any accomplices, not that I know of, but who knows?
You write very interestingly about David Torres, and we mentioned about Aurora having this surprisingly lack of evidence that they restored, or they retained, I should say. But also a very interesting fact that you mentioned is David Torres had a key to the evidence room. Would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, he did. Now he says, I didn't have that until I became a sergeant in 1994, but I would have no cause to dispose of any evidence. But evidence was disposed of. The photographs that Lindahl took of Debbie Colliander, the gun he used, and so on, all that's missing. And Detective Chris Loudon says, you're supposed to keep that evidence, especially when there's a homicide. And it's all gone. I don't know what happened to it, but it's gone.
You write about in the follow-up about the Beacon News, the articles, the effect, and also what it led to inadvertently, or you were part of, having the Pamela Maurer case solved, which led to more interest in Bruce Lindell and potentially other crimes that he may have committed. Tell us, you write about in terms of this overall effect of the Beacon News, your articles, and your involvement.
Well, I think the Beacon News had a huge impact on this because if it wasn't for all these articles that I did, the case against Deborah Colliander would have been dismissed at the first hearing, and nothing would have been made of anything. It was the newspaper article that put his name in the public eye, and people knew about him, and suddenly his neighbors, the people at the high school, they all knew about him, and that was the worst thing that could happen to a guy like that. He operated under the secrecy, where people didn't know who he was. That's how he could get women and attack women. Suddenly they knew who he was, and then once he died, articles mentioned other potential victims in other towns, and that sort of put the cops on alert to look into some of these cases. But that was in 1981. Nothing happened, and again, it would have needed DNA, which actually didn't exist in 1980. They did not have any DNA technology. All they could tell you was somebody's blood type. That was it.
You write about the broken system and the problem with rape cases inherently. Can you discuss that?
Well, especially in those days, when a woman made an accusation, especially if she went to court, she was put on trial more than the attacker was. Because
Right.
the lawyers could ask, what about your background? Do you have sex a lot? Did you ask for it? What were you wearing? On the other hand, they couldn't question the suspect at all. First of all, if he declined to take the stand in his own defense, then they couldn't ask him anything. But even if he did take the stand and ask him, they couldn't ask about any of his background. They couldn't even ask about any time he'd been charged with anything. So he had more rights than the victim did, which, it caused a lot of women not to want to go to court.
And what do you think can be learned from this case? I mean, obviously, you're saying is more thorough police investigation, but you also are critical of the court's decision and question how it was that the judge had no information. He didn't have a criminal record at that time with his first bail that he was released on for $4,000, but that was a crucial moment in his criminal career. What about the judge not knowing enough information from the basic charge itself in order to realize that this person might be dangerous and warrant no bond?
Well, this is in the initial attack when he was held in jail for Debbie Caliander. He was let out on only $4,000 bail. I mean, that's awful. If you look at the police report on this, which I have, it was an especially vicious attack. No judge should have, they should have said no bail, but they let him out on bail. And then after Debbie disappeared and the cops came to his house and he pulled a shotgun on him, he was let out, I think, the next day on $350 bail. Now, I can't say the judge didn't know. The judge would have to know because the state's attorney would have presented it. This is a dangerous man. He viciously assaulted this woman. She disappeared. We suspect he had something to do with it. He's a dangerous man. And he pulled a shotgun on cops. This is a dangerous man. And the judge said, okay, the bail out. I mean, the judge would have had to have known. Now, even if it wasn't convicted of these things, just the facts of the case, the state's attorney would have told the judge in asking to deny bail. But I don't see how the judge could not have known. And the judge gets the newspaper, so he would have seen all this in the newspaper as well.
It's incredible, too, after he's bailed out, they don't notify Deborah of these conditions. Very interesting. But also, when she is on October 7th, missing, again, they can't put two and two together in terms of suspicion, it seems.
Well, they bungled this whole case. They should have told Debbie when he bailed out. They should have told her. When she disappeared, they were specifically told, the cops were told, treat this like just another missing persons case, which, how could anybody with any common sense think that?
You couple that with David Torres's involvement in this, at first inadvertently and then after covertly. You say that maybe this wasn't just accidental, this whole thing with the evidence missing, key to the evidence room, and also his involvement with being his best friend, remarkably, and owning the home.
Yeah, I can't say something I can't prove. And I can't prove that he did anything with the evidence or that he had any influence or anything like that. I just have to state the facts and not draw a conclusion with him.
Yes, I understand. It just seems very suspicious for me, the reader, and I think our audience, when they listen to the facts of this case, it seems quite a mystery that not only were they not able to solve any of this, but also that all of this evidence went suspiciously missing.
Well, all I can do is state the facts, and if you can add two and two, then you can, think what you want. I think it's not difficult to come to a conclusion.
Absolutely. You write in the end that your stories played a small part in stopping Bruce Landau from getting away with the murder of Deborah Caliander and perhaps other women. Your articles contributed to pressure Bruce Landau to make him panic and act irrationally. And he wouldn't have gotten these threatening letters, which also pressured him and made him panic, if not for your incredible articles. And you also read at the very end, you were also alive, you say, because Bruce Landau is dead.
Yes, I will say that my newspaper articles had a huge amount to do with him not getting away with killing Debbie Caliander. He would have gotten away with it without my article. I also think it put a lot of mental pressure. In fact, Debbie's father even told me that. It put a lot of mental pressure on him. And I think he acted irrationally when he was stabbing that boy to death. I mean, he just went at him. He stabbed him 28 times and ended up stabbing himself by accident. I would like to think that my article sort of unbalanced him a little bit more, that caused his death. I would be happy to take credit for his death.
Yes.
Whatever extent I had in that. But the fact that he's dead means that there's a whole lot of women who are still alive. You know, when he died, the cops went through his house that day, and Lieutenant McDonald called me up and said, "Why is your name and address on a piece of paper in Lindahl's house?" I don't know. He said, "Next to the telephone book on a notepad, he had my name and my address." He said, "Well, we think that once the charges were dropped, he was going to come and kill you, to pay you back."
Wow.
But he died with 3 or 4 days after the charges were dropped, so he didn't have a chance.
Yeah, extraordinary. I want to thank you very much, Jim Ridings, for coming on and talking about Murder in the Fox Valley, the true story of serial killer Bruce Lindahl. For those that might want to take a look at this and other work, do you have a website and any social media do you do?
I'm on Facebook, and I'm at jimridings.com.
Thank you very much, Jim Ridings, Murder in the Fox Valley, the true story of serial killer Bruce Lindahl. It's been a fascinating interview. Thank you so much, and you have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you, Dan. You too.